So, welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. Today we're going to be talking a bit about space and time, Kant and Heidegger. And yeah, we'll have a very fruitful discussion, hopefully. So today I'm joined by Hale, Nicole, Tagen, and Mikey. Me being Mark. And I'll let them introduce themselves by order of mention, I guess. So, Hale, go introduce yourself.
Hey there, my name's Hale. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate philosophy student at VIU. Looking forward to the conversation. A couple years ago, I read quite a bit of Kant, but it's been a while. So I was just thumbing through some of it tonight and yesterday, so should be interesting.
Nicole, if you will.
Okay, I'll go. All right, so hi guys, my name is Nicole Kirigin. I'm a student at Fraser University. I am a third to fourth year undergraduate student. I'm in between, I'm in the cusp there. And I'm studying psychology and philosophy, and I'm really happy to be here. I used to know more about Kant. I'm in a similar boat as Hale, but I haven't read him deeply recently. So this is a little bit of a refresher for me, but I'm really excited to talk about this topic. So thank you for having me.
Was it me next? Who is next?
You can go ahead, Tagen.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Tagen Marshall. I am a VIU student. In my second year, it's always kind of fuzzy for me to figure out what year I'm technically in. And, I'm your friendly neighborhood Heideggerian over here, so hopefully I don't let him down, All right, Martin. Go Mariners. Thanks for having me, folks.
I guess it's my turn. So my name is Michael Robert Caditz. I'm an alumnus of Vancouver Island University, and now I'm just the technical guy running the controls. And if I have something to say about Kant, because I did learn a lot about Kant, I got a really good grade in that class. So I'll add something if I have something important to say. Thank you.
All right. So I'll begin our discussion. I'll just talk a little bit about Kant and space and time. Maybe we'll have a discussion, and then Tagen can take over with who's actually co-leading with me today. He'll bring the Heideggerian perspective. I think perhaps Aristotelian as well. We'll find out, won't we? So,
you sure will.
All right. So, Kant is a German philosopher, and I think he's best seen as responding to, the empiricist tradition, which is epistemic stance, right? So first came the rationalists and then the empiricists. So the rationalists were a group of people who believed that actually we acquire knowledge through our, innate reasoning, right? So it's not about going out in the world and discovering things. In fact, it's about reasoning and so on. And later, the empiricists came along and they sort of disagreed with that. And in fact, this can be seen with David Hume, who actually didn't think that we could know anything about the external world, non-empirically, right? We had to go out and see it and discover it for ourselves with our own senses to know what is out in the world. And this sort of segues into, a very crucial part in this topic, in what is called the analytic-synthetic distinction, and it's the distinction between judgment. So I think it probably comes back from Hume. He's one of the first people, and synthetic judgments or judgments about the world. So I could say, for example, my car is red, or I have a dog, right? Those are things about the world and judgments about them, and those are very, very different from, perhaps statements about concepts. Right? So I could say, perhaps the classic one is bachelors are unmarried, right? Well, the concept of unmarried is inside the concept of a bachelor, right? So I can say square is four corners, a triangle is three, right? Yeah. So Hume postulated that all synthetic judgments, they're only knowable empirically, and there's nothing you can reason your way to. And this is sort of where Kant, in a way, disagrees with Hume. He says that we can, in fact, have these synthetic judgments that we know non-empirically, which is what he calls a priori. So, of, I guess, things that judgments he would classify as synthetic and a priori. So one of them would be geometry or space. So he would say that space actually, we don't actually learn space empirically. We don't do it from discovery. In fact, we can space. There's nothing with geometry that is logically necessary, right? All proofs in geometry, they're sort of done in diagrams, right? And therefore it presupposes it itself, and it's not any logical requirement. It's just something that we reason our way through non-logically, and this sort of brings him to say that, well, how can we know things about space, prior to experience? How can we know things about the external world, when we don't have any contact with it? Why couldn't it? And it's not anything logical, right? Either. So how do we know that? And this sort of way of going about this is saying that, obviously, I think this is what he says in his own words, sort of, is that, it's not that the objects, or that our will sort of, our will conforms to the objects, it's that the objects external to us conform to our intuitions. And these appearances which we have, and in fact, we can never know these things in themselves, and we're only sort of left with our appearances. So I think, we can have a bit of a quick discussion on this, and I did move a bit quickly, so you can of course ask me to elaborate or clarify on anything. So
I'm fine starting here, so I'll actually ask a few clarifying questions, because I do have a bit of a baseline understanding of Immanuel Kant and his philosophy, but I don't know what he specifically said about space and time. So this is something that I will ask about. So would Kant say then that, like, you can know about space and time prior to experience a priori, and that is like, is that like his claim, or is there like more that goes into that, like more complexities? Because then, like, I could easily make like a counter argument if that is his only claim, but I anticipate there's more complexities about there, and perhaps you did say it, but just to maybe repeat that.
Well, I can definitely talk about it. So Kant is arguing that, well, I suppose what he's mainly arguing about is how we as subjects relate to the external world. And he uses his argument on space to ground that we do not in fact see things how they are, and that we sort of in fact have our sort of our understanding, and then we sort of try to fit the world into this understanding we have, or I guess like maybe perhaps like neurological tools, and then therefore it doesn't like accurately represent the way the world is. It's sort of as though like you're playing a game on your computer, right? And I can look at this, I guess house on my computer, right? Say I'm playing Minecraft and I've built a house. just because it's the data they're stored on my computer doesn't mean that if I opened up my computer and looked at my hard drive, whatever, I'd find a house, right? I'd find a bunch of ones and zeros, upon a metal plate. So he's saying that, we don't actually see the ones and zeros on the metal plate, that is the hard drive. We just see, I guess, we see sort of our intuition, which is sort of interpreted, these ones and zeros, that being the external world. So it's sort of part of a larger claim that...
Right. Yeah, so let me try to clarify that. So Kant is saying that we think that we know what space is a posteriori after experience by empirical knowledge. That he claims that we believe that that's the way that we know what space is, but he would say that from what the knowledge that we have and from the tools that we have, we can only guess and make a model of what space is, but not actually see what it is in reality. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I mean, for Kant, things in themselves exist non-spatio or temporarily. And he says that we only know space, we can know space exists prior to, any empirical research or anything like that. And yeah, he's saying the only way that can be possible is if, in fact, it doesn't relate to anything out in the world. And
right.
It's just, some form of intuition.
So it's almost like a backwards argument. He isn't trying to start out by saying that we only know space a priori, but he's starting with it's illogical to say that we only can know it a posteriori, which is through scientific analysis and observation. He's kind of commenting on that first, and then he comes to the conclusion that if this exists, then we must know space intuitively, before being able to study it. Is that kind of the direction that he goes in?
I think so. I think that's what you're getting at. His argument is sort of if A, then B. It can't be B, therefore it can't be A. So he's saying that, if we know, I guess, space a priori, then we'd have a priori judgments, right? And that doesn't make sense. So therefore, the judgments can't be about things in themselves or the external world. It just has to be about the subjective form of our sensibility or form of intuition.
Yeah, I think that makes quite a bit of sense. And I understand why he would try to make that kind of argument. And I understand, based on his underlying philosophy, I think I could understand how he would come to that conclusion. But I can think of a really simple counterexample to that, to Kant's ideas of our knowledge of space and time. Which is, people used to believe that the Earth was flat, not as a controversial thing, a hot take, but people actually used to believe that the Earth was flat before there were instruments that say that Earth is on a curve or whatever, right? And then people thought that if you take a boat to the end of the map, you'll fall off the Earth. And when people look up, they think it'll just be more Earth when you look up or whatever. I don't based on that knowledge, it doesn't make sense that people would come to intuitively come to the conclusion that space and time exists a priori, because there's several counterexamples, especially in the past, where it was common belief that the Earth is flat. If you'll fall off the edge of the Earth with this. They probably thought that there was something. Maybe that could be the case, but it's hard to go back now and to try to go into minds of people back then, because we're really relying on written knowledge there. But I don't know if I think it depends on actually how Kant defines what space is, because if people think that if we fall off the edge of the Earth, then there must be something else out there. Is that space? Are they thinking about space, or are they thinking about something else out there? How specific is it to postulate about space, and how specific is it to postulate about time? But let's just, I guess, focus on space first.
Yeah, I think you have a point there where it's sort of like how much can our, I guess, a priori judgments be correct? But I think the thing, though, is that sort of what he means about space, right, is he's sort of talking about the natural laws in space where, you can say that, I guess perhaps that a line could extend infinitely, right? Or that a triangle would have 3 corners.
Okay,
It's
so
sort
it's
of like
very
the more
specific.
analytic things.
Yeah, he has like a very specific like definition of what space is, and it's like more of the laws of space and the analytic like claims about space. That's what he's saying that space is. It's not like just the perception that, oh, there must be something out there, but like instead it's like, oh, gravity exists and these things exist, and then space will, line will just continue going infinitely. Like, yeah, go ahead.
Like, we like have to be careful about like what he's saying by like terms like knowledge and exists. At the end of the day, like Kant is trying to legitimate metaphysics to science. Like that was his big concern, right? Is basically how can we make metaphysics like a real science? It basically seems to be like a lot of baloney when we look at it. Then his main thing was to go, okay, well, metaphysics is about concepts that seem if metaphysics was a thing, they would be, synthetic a priori. They would be concepts that exist prior or known prior to experience or without the necessitation of experience, but give us new knowledge beyond the concept itself, which would be an analytic concept wherein the definition includes all potential explanations of the concept. So when like we're jumping over a lot of steps and stuff, and it's been a while since I read this, but one of the big things with space and time is space and time is not really something that's encountered or experienced. It's the grounds for the possibility of any sort of metaphysical or any possible experience at all. So I don't go out and find space. I don't go out and encounter time. It's always already in the background for me to have any kind of synthetic experience at all. Whether space be on a page or space be an infinite grid because I'm now exist in a computer, the kind of being that I am is a being that presupposes space and temporality. It's a very, very, I think from at least my reading memory, very, very brief.
Yeah, no, it does sound correct, and it links up that way with that. It's necessary for experience, and therefore, once we do have experience, it's something we can know, I guess, prior to any empirical research or something.
Yeah, and whether or not like space or time is real, independent of us, is really not like, I think for Kant, like that's the kind of like he split like a little bit of him splitting the difference like between like you mentioned like the rationalists and the empiricists. It's like, look, like we have a certain empirical structure that we can like, and that's the point of metaphysics. We're going to go back and figure out that stuff. There is a structure there, but whatever that structure is locked into ourselves, and whatever sort of knowledge of the world we're going to get we're going to get through experience, and we can't kind of transcend our bubble to get like non-empirical information about the world itself. And that was the big divide, because that's what rationalists were in a sense a lot of the times trying to do prior to Hume. And that was Hume's big gripe, was like, well, like you're not going to get like stuff outside of experience. And Kant's saying, okay, well, there is stuff we can kind of get outside of experience. That's metaphysics, and metaphysics is essentially how is, in a way we might even call it like, how is consciousness structured regardless of any experience, or to be the grounds of the possibility of any experience with some of the, like the technical language. Like that is about like our structure specifically, and like what my room is like outside of me being in it is not something we're ever going to figure out.
Yeah, and going back to what you were saying about, I guess, the rationalist and empiricist, I really feel like Kant tried to sort of unite them in a way, where he said that sure, we have like these, I guess you can only learn things empirically. However, what you see empirically is categorized, right, by your, I guess, rationality, right? And in that sense, it is actually, I guess, it's not just experience; it's also your reasoning, which contributes to your knowledge.
There's all. I was just going to say there. Like, I think Kant's point is that like exactly what you're saying, which is that like, and this gets into his like 12 categories and a bunch of stuff that like I can't remember. But there's always already a structure to being human, right? To being human conscious, to experience, right? And that stuff is the judgments that we can make about that stuff from that stuff are the synthetic a priori judgments.
No, definitely. I felt I could really relate to Kant's distinction between sensibility and cognition. And he argues that, and I think this is very true that you having a sense experience is very different from you having a sense experience and forming concepts and understanding about it. And I've definitely experienced where I guess I've had a sense experience, but I haven't really like conceptualized what was happening. Whether I think recently I was looking at some clothing and they had like a mirror behind it, and it just formed this weird way in which I couldn't apply my, I guess, Euclidean idea of space to it. And then I took a step back and then I realized that, okay, it's structured this way, and that's why I got confused. But yeah.
I'd like to hear what Tagen has to say about this too.
Yeah.
Oh, man. All right, Martin, I apologize in advance because you never know what's going to happen here. All right, let's go and see if I can wake up for this. So, in a sense, listening to Mark, I almost feel like I'm comparing apples to oranges. I'm comparing a phenomenologist and an existentialist to an empiricist. And that doesn't always work out so well. So when we talk about time, let's just say our good buddy Martin ain't such a big fan of what Kant presents as his transcendental argument. And this is where I'm going to rely on Mark, see if he knows or if one of you knows, could briefly describe what a transcendental argument is.
In the Kantian term or like Heideggerian term? Because
in the Kantian term.
Okay. Well, to me, it sounds. I think it's the same thing as a transcendental exposition, and it just has to do with a synthetic a priori judgment. He frames it. I forget the quoting. I can even bring it up if I have to, but essentially, it's just a, I guess, judgment or deduction, right? Where the only possible, it sort of frames the exposition as a principle where the only possible, like, sort of explanation is through a transcendental or synthetic a priori judgment.
Okay.
Something like that.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so as I just stated, I think you can... Heidegger's critique of Kant is that basically, or maybe not his critique of Kant, but the very rough and loose idea that comes to mind is that Heidegger doesn't see time as the be-all and end-all. Rather, it is the experiences we have within the world we understand. And so when we deal with a concept like the importance of space, space and time for Kant are necessary for existence, because space and time are always going to exist within our life, within our interactions. But I think that's partially because, as I stated briefly, Heidegger is a phenomenologist. So he is looking at the human person in the sense of their experience, not necessarily empirical research, but rather the perception of the world around them. And I guess you could say Heidegger would say that time is, I don't want to say that for Heidegger time is just not necessary, but I think Heidegger, because he is always looking at the experience itself to interpret the meaning, isn't necessarily looking at the contextualization of the experience, rather what is learned or experienced through the phenomenon. So I guess to clarify why this would be a position that a phenomenologist would take, and then I want to open it to discussion a little bit, is that there are three principles of phenomenology when we look at the world, interpret the world and phenomenon. And I've listed them before, but you can sure bet I'm going to list them again, because why not? So let's list them. The first one is to the things themselves, right? So when we're studying something, for example, like a philosophical text, we must go to that thing or that phenomenon. So say in this case we're talking about something to do with us, what we're experiencing. Say we're in a situation and we're questioning what to do next. We have to go to that phenomenon, but this more often than not happens retrospectively, I might add. This rarely happens in the moment. It's not like the phenomenologist is like, okay, so let's just really look at this for a second and figure out what we're gonna do. No, that doesn't work. But when we look at something, we must look at it for what it is, not necessarily what we want it to be. So in the concept of space and time, it's easy to say, oh yeah, well, they're necessary for existence. Heck, I would even agree with that personally. But Heidegger, I think, wants to really think about that and say, but we don't contextualize really on an individual basis our existence based on where we are within space and time. Rather, it's the interactions we have with the world. The second principle, and if anyone needs clarity on this, please ask once I'm done these. I just want to get these out. Second is all acts are interpretive. So everything we do is done because of our beliefs or our thoughts, or maybe even our feelings. Will translate into our actions and our behaviors towards other people. And all acts are interpretive to the individual, because, say for example, Nicole might do something, say steal a loaf of bread, for example. And I, not knowing her background or her rationale, might say, well, might take the obvious position and say, well, that's illegal. Why would you do that? Like, honestly. But her interpretation of that might be a little more. There might be a little more depth. She might be caring for someone who is deathly ill, and neither of them have the money to pay for the thing. But that's her interpretation of the action, that versus mine. So all acts are interpretive. And then, I feel like these are poor examples, but bear with me here. I think my phenomenology professor would be profoundly disappointed. I guess I'll find out. And 3, the world in which you dwell arises out of a fundamental commitment. So how might we look at this in terms of Kant? Kant's fundamental commitment was, as Marx stated, basically to try and bring our understanding, the traditional understanding of metaphysics, and see if we could put them and science together. And so he is going to look at those things like existence within things that are more scientific, such as space and time, because those are theoretically measurable. They exist, and therefore, because they are the baseline for anything we experience, then Kant argues that they are necessary conditions. They're not just sufficient conditions, they're actually necessary for conditions. Not for conditions, for existence. So I think Heidegger's, as stated before, I think his critique would be, but no one actually thinks that way. No one goes through life and goes through experience thinking that way. Thinking that, oh, well, how does this relate? No one goes through life consciously thinking, unless they're us right now, thinking about how does time and space relate to this. Rather, they're looking at phenomenon, they're looking at possibility and trying to determine what's best for them. All right, now I'll open it to discussion and maybe fierce critique. I don't know, but let's go.
I actually have something about the last point here. As a question, actually, or clarification. So you would say, like, Heidegger's response to Kant would likely be something like, "Oh, this is unnecessary," or would it be like unnecessary because nobody goes through life doing this type of overthinking? Can you clarify that last point a little bit more?
Yeah. I want to make it perfectly clear that I might be vastly misrepresenting Heidegger and what he stands for, so no Heideggerians come after me, okay? But he would say, like, he's very critical of Kant's transcendental argument, because he basically says, but you're over harder than it needs to be. You're making this way more than it needs to be, because he would say that space is just something that's there. It's not necessarily something that needs to be considered. He wouldn't go as far to say it's not necessary, but he would say that those that do consider it are kind of missing the point of their very existence, I think.
Okay, so it's like a kind of almost, I don't want to say this term, but it's almost like a value judgment, right? Like in terms of like how Heidegger would respond to Kant's transcendental argument. It's more like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this because there's more. You have Like it's because based on the third point, which the world in
Right.
which we dwell is a fundamental commitment. Is that where you're
Right.
getting at? Okay.
Well, what?
I think.
Oh, go ahead, Hale.
I just listened to Tagen, and I think thinking about Heidegger and thinking about Kant. I mean, I can't. Heidegger was profoundly influenced by Kant, like for sure, and he wrote numerous books and lecture series and stuff on him. I can't comment too. Like, it's been so long since I've spent time there was a period where I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the transcendental deduction, and that was like I said at the beginning, it was a while ago. So I'm like, in my head, I'm like, how did that all fit together again? But I'll say this: I think the scopes of which the two approach the concept of time is wildly different, and that relates back to their foundational, one might say, ontological perspectives. But you might be able to say, in a sense, that Kant takes a much narrower scope on time, whereas Heidegger takes a much wider scope on time, as he calls it, and uses the terminology instead temporality, in which, if my memory serves me right, Kant saw time, when we take time and space as two fundamental structures that for the grounds for the possibility of any type of experience for human consciousness or whatever, Kant starts by trying to build metaphysics, or build the reasonable grounds for metaphysics being science, but in a odd way ends up in epistemology. Time becomes the inner structuring of the mind, right? So in a sense, we can imagine any thought, any conscious experience that I have is in time, right?
Right.
Then space, it kind of categorizes as the outer experience, which structures the world as a spatial, three-dimensional place. Again, gross simplification, but I do believe that's roughly correct. Whereas Heidegger would say that, so basically we have time is that with Kant is that narrow inner structuring of the human condition, the human consciousness. Whereas Heidegger would say that time or temporality, it has a much wider breadth. Heidegger really wants to get away from that. We talked about this last time, like a subjective objective Cartesian split, which Kant is still very much rooted in trying to figure out the individual's consciousness as the root of any sort of possible world, phenomenal world, quote unquote. But Heidegger basically wants to say that temporality is so much more, is a shared historical, cultural, active experience that doesn't just arise out of some sort of physical structuring of the mind, but is instead is not a concept, but is a grounds for the possibility of worlds that we inhabit, right? Of meaning on that more broad phenomenological sense. And again, that temporality is then not just a sort of structuring of mental consciousness, but is a fact, the ability for me to understand myself, for things to make sense, the ability for my world to be possible. And what temporality is and how it shows itself changes through periods and changes through historical origins and stuff. Whether or not that it was some relative, I think, stability, but that it is much more fluid and flexible and wide in that sense. If that
can I come in here as somebody who doesn't know much about Heidegger to try to get some sort of interpretation here? So would Heidegger say that actually I think I lost my point, but actually no, I'll come back to it when I remember. But you got to take it. You can go forward.
Yeah, Hale, I appreciate that. That was a good reminder for me as well. That the way Heidegger views time, even time itself, is basically an experience. Because time, I think, Hale, what you're kind of getting at is the fact that time is not a straight line for Heidegger. Time exists and interacts within the different stages of our lives, the different worlds and stuff like that. And there is a specific each of those worlds, right? Such as our childhood, maybe our adulthood, and then eventually our death. Am I doing you somewhat justice here, or am I
think,
off base?
yeah, totally. And I think when, at least again, trying to conceive of, and I think Heidegger's critique is, and this is, going as someone who has read a reasonable amount of Heidegger and tried to figure it out as best possible, given his kind of notoriety as being rather obtuse. That like for Kant is still stuck in the tradition, especially epistemologically, of trying to figure out like how the world comes from like in here, in and of the mind,
Right.
whereas Heidegger is saying, well, this goes back to I think any Heideggerian concept, it's never in here, it's always out there, and the same is true of time as well. And that I think that again, that's a real simplification, but I think at least when I think about the two thinkers, when I know about them, I think that's one of the great divides between them, is Kant still trying to figure out how things are structured from in here, whereas Heidegger is saying that's ridiculous. We are being in the world, we are out in the world, and everything about what we are and how the world is out there with us, and blah, 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 blah. We get all the weird terminology, but...
Yeah, so I do want to say I remember my point, and it's related to what Tagen was saying last and also this time. So my question is, would Heidegger say that the external world and / or either our constructs such as space and time are merely a vector for our personal development? And the way I'm getting that is because I know he's an existentialist. Would he say that, or would he say we are more like, because also the feel that I get from what you're saying last, Hale, is that almost that Heidegger would say that we are more in tune with our external world and constructs as being a part of ourselves. So I don't really what would he kind of say about that? Like, what is basically is the most important thing for Heidegger our individuality and our personal selves? Or
Nicole, sorry, can you define my brain? Can you define vector for me real quick?
Vector is like something that something else lives in. That's like this. It doesn't really mean much by itself, but like when somebody else lives in it, it has meaning.
Well, remember, I mean, I'll take a crack at this, Hale, and then I'll let you take this, because I could be... Sorry, Nikki, can you restate your question one more time?
Yeah. So here's the question. So would Heidegger say that the external world and / or our constructs, such as time and space, so one of them is a weak claim, one of them is a strong claim, would he say that those things are merely a vector for our own personal development, meaning that our personal development, individuality, and autonomy are the most important things, and everything else like is a shadow to that?
I think he might. I think he would probably say that you're close, because our development. Remember when we talked about Dasein a while ago, and we did a Heidegger-centered show. We talked about Dasein, right, and how Dasein, the very way that being interacts with the world is through experience, and it reaches out, right? Every time I think of Dasein, I think of a baby sitting and playing, and there's the red ball, and they want the red ball, so they reach for the red ball, or they crawl for the red ball, right? They want that ball, so there's their meaning and purpose, is we're gonna get that ball. So they reach out, and when they get the ball, they gain an experience. They gain experiential knowledge, and so then they continue on through life. So he would say that not that the external world and our concepts of space and time are totally irrelevant, but he would say that those are basically the framework that we focus on our development, and they're the framework that makes that possible.
I have a question actually, and I think it relates to an earlier point. And it has, so it has to sort of do with I guess of course talking about like Kant and I guess Heidegger is bit of a weird thing to do because, Heidegger's a phenomenologist who sort of rejects, the appearance thing and the self-distinction. But even from like a, I guess, experiential point of view, which would be Heidegger, I don't think that what is necessary for your life is the same as what you think about your life when you look back on it. Perhaps it's the main thing about that life or the main takeaway for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's, I guess, necessary for it. I don't think it follows, perhaps, but maybe I'm looking at it in a different way.
But I mean, I guess you might say, though, for the existentialist, all there really is you. So I mean, Hale, were you gonna jump in there?
Yeah, I was just thinking, could you repeat your question, Mark?
Okay.
Your quandary.
Yeah. It was something. So I was sort of responding, I guess, to this comment, and I found its structure a bit weird because it sort of, I thought, maybe conflated, I guess, necessity of life with what you, I guess, necessarily, think about in your daily life, or perhaps the main takeaway from your life when you look back at your life. And I thought that they aren't necessarily the same thing. That, necessity for life is, I guess, your main takeaway from life, or so on. I don't think it follows. I think you'd have to have an additional argument for that. But does that sort of answer? I can try and clarify more if you want.
Do you wanna just say a little bit more about that?
Okay. Well, I guess sort of by my view of necessity, okay, so just because you don't, I guess, think about it from day to day life, right? Like me going to work, right? I don't think about putting on my shoes, right? And then going to work, although it's quite essential for me to have shoes to walk to work, right? Because else my feet are going to get very scuffed up and maybe I'll step in glass. So it doesn't necessarily follow that because you don't think about it, during your life is, day-to-day life, that it is in fact necessary for it. However, I do think shoes would be quite a necessary part of life, even though we don't really think of, I'm walking in a shoe in a day-to-day life.
The comment is that just because something we don't think about something doesn't mean that doesn't make it necessary.
Oh, just because we don't pay attention to like a certain thing in our day-to-day life doesn't make it non-necessary.
Not necessary or not real?
Not necessary. Because we were talking about the Kant.
I would think like talking about necessity. I think we're talking about Heidegger right now. Like, personally, I haven't encountered like too much discussion specific necessity, but I think that what you're getting at would actually be something he would, at least from my reading interpretation, he would generally agree with, which is that like most of the things that we do in our life that make us who we are not things that we consciously examine and interpret it through like mental representation. It's stuff that we just do. Is sort of like sounds overly simplistic, but a lot of the time that's what it is. Yeah, I don't know if you feel like that's any kind of response to that, but
I think it does, but I think I still have the underlying question with regards to space, in that I say even from an experiential point of view, it is necessary in that sense, in that, I go from my place to work and then I go back and I do stuff and I go places, right?
Well, I guess it might be a question of what do you do within that space, right? Because that's where the question becomes, Because yeah, space is gonna happen. Obviously, you're gonna travel distances. You're gonna go do things. So I guess if you were to focus on that, the question would then become, what are you experiencing while you're in that space? So maybe it might be, you're driving your car or you're listening to music. So you still are experiencing things within that space. And so I would say that he would say that space is, like, I think Heidegger might say that space, is necessary, but I think he would say that, I think it's the issue of focus, right? It's the issue of, but that's not really what he's getting at. He's getting at the actual things you encounter well in the space, not necessarily space itself.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to weigh in on the Kant versus Heidegger question, and I have a different view than you guys have expressed. So I think that Kant lays the groundwork for Heidegger. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So Heidegger is a phenomenologist, correct?
Correct.
So Kant also uses the word when he describes the phenomenal world, or a variation of the word.
Right.
So the question is, are they using the word in different ways, or is there some continuity? And I'm arguing that there's continuity. Because what Kant does is, when he describes space, he describes it as an intuition, as a sensibility. It's in the phenomenal world. It's the way that people relate to the world. And it's a priori because there's no other way. It's impossible not to relate to the world, according to Kant, within the manifold of space and time. They're a priori. We can't escape space and time. But space and time are so Kant uses the term transcendent. And what he means, so the definition of transcendent, or the three characteristics of transcendence, would be an origin, that which is surpassed, and the arrival. So space, according to Kant, is transcendent. It arises in our consciousness. It surpasses all objects of possible experience, and it arrives at the horizon. This is a phenomenon in human consciousness, an a priori phenomenon. It's the way that it's the manifold within which we exist. And Kant argues that because it's a priori, we're justified in understanding the world in this way, as a phenomenon. And that's why Kant argues for synthetic a priori knowledge. We can know about the world because that's the way our phenomenal world is. Although Kant admits that we have no access to the noumenal world, we don't know what the real world is. All we can ever know is the way we experience the world. And so Kant justifies phenomena, the way that humans relate to the world, the way that humans perceive the world. He justifies that as being a criteria of knowledge. And to me, that lays the groundwork and gives permission for Heidegger to go in a slightly different direction. Heidegger is not a carbon copy of Kant, but Heidegger can build upon Kant's justification and credibility given to the phenomenal world. And Heidegger can say that it's the way that humans interact with the world and the way that humans perceive the world that matters. And that's very similar in that respect to what Kant argued.
Yeah, so Mikey, I just see we're running low on time here. I guess the one thing I would say that you brought up is probably the paramount paramount distinction between Heidegger and Kant, which is that Kant tries to express reason and logic within the world, which is a good and noble thing. But I think Heidegger says, but in fact, this is his critique of pure reason, is the fact that reason by itself is not strictly the essence of human existence. Rather, it is experience that really brings to the fullness our ability to reason and to rationalize. And there's one quote from the article I've been working from that I just want to briefly read, that I believe is from Heidegger when he discusses Kant's transcendental, where he says the following: "The phrase transcendental aesthetic and transcendental logic mean the same thing as ontological aesthetic and ontological logic." So Heidegger is pointing towards an overcomplication of a concept.
Yeah, and to me, the concept of space and time as being a manifold, as being objects of our sensibilities, is not complicated at all. I mean, I'm aware of space and time. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to figure it out. It's just there. And
It's just
very
there.
simple. That's what Kant argues. It's just there. It's in our consciousness, and there's no escape.
Yeah. I think that I know we only got a few minutes left, but I really like what you had to say, Mikey, and I think that was really correct. And I think that, at least from my personal readings, Heidegger has much more in common with Kant than disagreement with him. I think it's the trajectory is that they go from that groundwork. I mean, Western philosophy is a lot owes so much to Kant, and I, more than an existentialist, I like to think of Heidegger as a descriptive phenomenologist, in terms of he goes out and describes what is it like to exist, rather than value judgments about how we should exist or all that kind of stuff. Kant's argument, again, going back to finding foundations of metaphysics, is that space and time are internal to the human mind. Heidegger I think the difference with Heidegger is he recognizes those as foundational to the world. Being Heidegger sidesteps questions of self and individualism separated from that external internal world split. Right? So whereas Kant is still working within the general schema of that split, the confusion comes in because Heidegger is kind of sidestepping that and saying space and time, yeah, totally real, totally necessary, background for the possibility of all stuff, background for the possibility of world, which we are a part of, rather than the self and space and time projecting out from that in one way or another.
Yeah, well, Kant lays the groundwork for science, or he saves science from Hume's skepticism. So Kant says, now that we can agree on certain synthetic a priori judgments, now we can go out and discover what the world is like in a correspondence sense. We can develop a correspondence knowledge which corresponds to the way the phenomenal world is. And that's a different direction than Heidegger went. So Heidegger went in the direction of, well, you actually can't separate or distinguish between the world out there as some kind of object and you, the observer, as a subject, because you interact with the world phenomenally, right? You interact with the world, and the world appears to you in the way that you interact with it. So they went in different directions. But my point was that they still each use as their foundation the idea that there's a phenomenal world merely because that is what humans know.
Yeah.
And both, And I was just going to say, and I think just real quick, like I was saying too, for both of them, space and time are absolutely fundamental preconditions for the grounds for the possibility of that world. How they then interpret those two concepts changes, but they both recognize those two things as being absolutely foundational for there being any phenomenal world at all.
All right. Well, we're out of time. So, Mark, do you want to do the closing, or can I take it?
Well, I did the introduction, so...
Okay, so anyway, thanks for joining us, folks. This has been the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm Tagen Marshall with my co-hosts, Michael Robert Caditz, Nicole Kirigin. Hale, what's your last name again?
Rothery.
And we got Mark Giles. This has been the Canadian Philosophy Show. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye now.
Okay.